Coming up next on Public Access TV is Fan to Fan, the book game, where we look at the game of publishing books. Today my guest is Thomas Hall, educator and author of 4 crime novels, and now his latest literary effort, The Last 3 Houses on Bowman Street, a somewhat biographical and historical novel tracing the timeline of a family from the great-grandmother's arrival from Ireland into New York at the end of the 19th century through future generations, struggles, and successes in the turbulent times of the early 20th century. Stay tuned. This will be historic and may soon have you searching your own ancestry. Welcome to Fan, the book game version. I'm your host, Dave Hornfischer. I'm a book fan, and I'm excited to look at the game of book publishing, where we talk to people who got their book ideas into print. Today, I'm pleased to welcome back fellow EMAS senior softball player Tom Hall, a retired educator and now the author of The Last 3 Houses on Bowman Street, a somewhat biographical, historical novel tracing the timeline of his family from his great-grandmother's arrival from Ireland into New York at the end of the 19th century through future generations' struggles and successes in the turbulent times of the 20th century. Tom, welcome back to Fan. It's good to have you here. And
nice to be back.
When you were here last time, we talked about mystery novels, 4 of them, which were great. I loved the detectives, the FBI guys. I wanted more of that. And now this. So how does a guy make that transition?
Well, you know, I think I mentioned last time I was here that with the mystery novels, I first started out, just got a germ of an idea, and then I kind of ran with it. And that's what happened this time. Just an idea came into my head, and as I said, I went in and I wrote the first chapter, and kind of went from there. It's funny. Before I started writing, I would hear authors talk about the fact that when people would ask, where do your ideas come from? And they'd say, I'm not really sure. And I said, well, how could that be? But it is that way. It is. Yeah. I'm not thinking about it. I'm not sitting down saying, oh, I got to come up with an idea. All of a sudden, something just pops into your head and you feel compelled to go with it. And that's kind of what happened here.
And this is all family stuff, where there's stories that you've probably heard or knew of or all your life, right?
I would say probably about 40% of it is that.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have to embellish some of the things and do what's going on, but yeah, it is based on family to some degree. But for example, my great-grandmother is the primary protagonist throughout the book. But the truth is that she passed away in 1933 or so, and so I never knew her.
Right.
But it's important to have one central character through the entire book, it seems, especially historical novels. So, I did that with her.
Of course, doing a book like this that transverses the whole 20th century, there's a lot of history that had to happen, and I think in having read and really enjoyed the book, I really enjoyed the connection to the history of the times, and you bring a lot of reality into it, first from the family story, from the people, and as well as from what's going on behind them.
And I think I've read a number of historical novels, and the ones I like the most are the ones that the families or the people in them relate to the historical events in some way. You can't just have them isolated, because that's what makes it human in a sense, is that the events of the times can influence the people, or vice versa. The people of the time can influence the historical events. So it's important to tie those things together all the time. For example, I don't know exactly. My great-grandmother did come to the United States from Ireland in 1894, as I have in the book. But I don't know the circumstances of her life in Ireland. So I had to make all of that up, which allowed me to bring in the whole notion of the inheritance laws in Ireland, which were pretty draconian in terms of, especially in terms of women. Right. For example, the second female child in the household, for example, couldn't get married until the first female child had gotten married, and things like that. And the oldest son inherited all the property. You couldn't, in a will, say, well, I'm going to give some to this child and some to that. Couldn't do it, and so forth. And that affected why people made the decision to emigrate.
Right. You know, putting real stories with the history always, to me, always makes a more exciting book.
I agree.
And you did a lot of research behind this too. In that, I mean, I'm certainly impressed with all of the details. And let's kind of wind our way through the book a little bit. You begin with the immigrant life in New York City around 1900 with the tenements. And you know, there's an excellent book. I think we have the cover coming up for it that you mentioned.
Yeah, I think you're talking about Jacob Riis, who was actually he was a photojournalist, if you will. And one of the things he was able to do, the tenements were always obviously very dark and dank places and whatnot. And one of the things he was able to do is he found, they used to have the flash photography. They used to have the flash photography all the time, and they were hesitant to do that in the tenements because of a fire hazard. Oh. So he found another way to bring light to it. And so he filmed in the tenements, and it's interesting, the title of his book has become part of our lexicon, and the title of his book was How the Other Half Lives. And we use that phrase all the time now to talk about that, but at that point it just dealt with the people who lived in the tenement and the squalid conditions that were there. And
those were the houses where immigrants were pretty much
yes,
directed towards.
Yes.
They were lucky they had that.
Yes, exactly.
And then, but then there were some real heroes then, the people who ran some of these houses, and you have one in your book, and we have a picture of her coming up.
Right. Lillian Wald, last name is spelled W-A-L-D, just an incredible human being. She went to nursing school early on, and then she actually read and saw the pictures in Jacob Riis's book, and she said, I need to do something about this. And her family was pretty well off. They lived in Rochester, New York, and she asked them for a donation, and she started a settlement house in New York, and allowed all immigrants to come. Any immigrants coming off the boat could come to the settlement house, and they would feed them and clothe them and whatnot, and eventually get them jobs.
And did your grandmother actually live in a Lillian Wald house, or was that part of your author license?
That was part of the author license.
Okay.
I have no idea, you know,
well, she
what
probably
she did when she came. There's a good chance.
Something like that, for sure.
And she wasn't the only one that did settlement houses. There were other people as well, but she, as I said, she just volunteered. And as I said, she was a nurse, and she would also, besides her own settlement house, she would travel to the tenement houses that were close by and give of her services for free of anybody that needed them.
And she was Jewish.
She was Jewish, and this presented some problems because back then there was all sorts of prejudice against various groups, and sometimes, and she talks about this freely in some of the writings that she did, she would go to a tenement house to try and care for some of the children that were sick, and the mothers would say, no, you're Jewish, you're not going to take care of my child.
These were the Irish immigrants who were being discriminated against themselves.
In some instances, absolutely true.
Amazing.
Yeah.
The human condition continues to amaze and always has, I guess, doesn't it? Well, then, so after all of this life in the city, your family starts to move, and a lot of others start to move out to then discovered Long Island, which begins to grow in the 1920s, and
right.
Yes, it goes all the way through the 50s.
Right. I have it in the book that well, I guess I'll go back a moment to that. My great grandfather was a policeman in New York City at the same time that Theodore Roosevelt was the commissioner in Newark. If any of you watch Blue Bloods, they have a picture of Roosevelt in the back there because he in fact was a commissioner there, and I have it that my great-grandfather was an aide to Roosevelt, which wasn't exactly true, but it's interesting because Roosevelt as well read Jacob Riis's book, and he took a look at the tenements and saw what the conditions were in there, and he started to clean up the police department in New York because some of they weren't policing the area, they weren't doing anything, they were asleep sometimes. He went out on a and this is a true story, he went out on a mission, if you will, with Jacob Riis to the tenements to take a look at night, and he found almost half of the police weren't doing their job, weren't even on where they were. So he cleaned some things up in there. But Roosevelt also had a lot of connections and whatnot, and I have it that my great-grandfather asked him about these connections and where would they recommend that they move to, because they wanted to move, and the connections suggested that they move out to Long Island. And Freeport was a place that they could afford.
Is that far out the island, Freeport?
No, it's probably it's in Nassau County, probably about 30 miles from the city.
So so they get out there, and all of a sudden they're having connections with the Roosevelt family through her teaching and
right. You know, and my great-grandparents actually did buy a house in Freeport, and there was a man by the name of John Randall. I changed his name to Rendell, but it's actually Randall, and there is a Randall's Island in Freeport, and he did a lot of work there. But he was also part of the bank there, and he was one of the first ones to give mortgages. Mortgages weren't 30-year mortgages like they are today. They were like 6 or 7 years, and then you would have to renew them and so forth. So my great-grandparents did in fact do that, and were able to purchase a house at a reasonable price. And my great-grandmother did some volunteering in the schools.
So now we're up into World War I and 1920 period, and we've got all kinds of stuff happening. The family's getting involved in the war.
Yes, my grandfather, at that point, he was very much wanted to serve. He did, in fact. He was one of the doughboys, if you will.
Really?
But he didn't go overseas at all. He was still in the area, and he was big afterwards. He was big in the VFW. You know, his service there was very important to him, and it was interesting though, because I have it in the book a little bit, that there's a little confliction there, because as there was in the country about whether we should get involved or not, you know, and of course the Lusitania sinking changed a lot of people's minds in terms of that, but even, and that's one of the things I have, even within the family, there's some disagreement there, which was the case, you know, and you could make an argument, that's what I try and do in the book, an argument for both sides, you know, isolationism versus, you know, getting involved and so forth. And again, that was going on all over the country, so it was an easy way to
As we talk through this, you know, the thought comes across my mind that this is such an interesting way to tell history to people, you know, even of our generation who weren't there in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And reading this, it just brings us all so to life by focusing on these real people, how they were dealing with the fact that their son might have to go off to war, and what their business impact was going to be in their house, and who was going to pay the mortgage, and all these kinds of issues that were, you know, even more relevant and more difficult, well, they're equally difficult today, I guess, but,
right.
You know, when you get into World War I in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, all through there, I mean, we've got coming up here issues such as Prohibition, the women's right to vote, the Depression, World War II, and your family went through all this.
Exactly.
Especially you make a great story about Prohibition and their role in it.
Right. It's interesting. One of the nicest compliments I got from about the book was a woman in my wife's book club read it, and she said, and she's an immigrant, and she said, I learned so much, and she said, but it wasn't like a textbook.
Right.
But I learned so much, and that was one of the biggest compliments I got. That you know, you can get all the information you need in a sense, but it's in a story as opposed to just hard facts that are
Put
there.
you asleep.
Yeah, exactly.
I found I couldn't put this down when I got reading it.
Well,
I just wanted to go from one chapter to the next, and then when I'm hearing out all of your family's connection with the importing of Irish whiskey, that was an exciting story.
Yes, and Freeport is interesting in a number of ways also because I have in the book something called the Freeport Club, but that actually did exist, and these were kind of the movers and shakers that lived in Freeport, and they would meet weekly and so forth, and kind of decide certain things that would go on in terms of that. In addition, I bring this up and then I'll get back to the Prohibition thing in a second. There was also a group called Lights, which actually existed, called the Long Island Glad-Hearted Thespian Society. And they actually created a clubhouse, built a clubhouse there. And a lot of the famous people, actors and so forth from New York, during the summer would come out there. So in our generation would have heard of these people, but other people may not. But Diamond Jim Brady and Lillian Russell and W.C. Fields and Broderick Crawford and the Marx Brothers and Will Rogers, all of them came out to Freeport during the summer. Some of them even purchased homes there, to live.
Of course, one of the big issues that you get into with Freeport is the difficult issue of racism, and which eventually leads up, your stories with Jackie Robinson. But Freeport had some real issues, you were telling me.
Right. I'll just go back for a second because you mentioned about Prohibition. I didn't really respond to that.
We got to move on.
I'll go back to that. The first house on Bowman Street, although it's not really Bowman Street, but it is a street in Freeport. It has a different name. I'm not going to say what it is. The first one was what my great-grandparents bought. Next door to that, they had there was another lot there, but they actually owned that property. So my great uncle decided that he was going to build a house there. But this was during the Depression and during Prohibition. So where did he possibly get the money to buy this house? And he paid for it up front. So I think he was involved in bootlegging, but it's my family, so I made him able to buy the house because of a clever thing he came up with, which I won't spoil if anybody wants to read the book. But he had a clever way of benefiting from that. Anyway, but going back to what you talked about with the racism in
Jackie Robinson coming up here.
Right on Long Island, the Ku Klux Klan was very big on Long Island in the 1920s, which was hard for me to believe as I was doing my research. In fact, in 1924, in Freeport, there was a Ku Klux Klan march, and there were 1,200 Klansmen hooded marching down the main street in Freeport. Only one person didn't have his hood up, and he led the parade, and that was the chief of police of Freeport.
Wow.
And that's how flagrant it was and how accepted it was that you would do that. And what makes it even worse is, at that time, the black population in Freeport was probably 30 to 40%. And yet, here this
and then that all
going
continues up through the 40s and what Robinson had to put up with.
Right. Interestingly enough, one of the people who had a home briefly in Freeport was Branch Rickey.
Oh, really?
And Branch Rickey is the one who was responsible for getting Robinson into the major leagues. Now, in 1955, the Brooklyn Dodgers won the World Series. Jackie Robinson was a hero in the whole metropolitan New York area for Brooklyn Dodger fans. He and his wife came to Long Island and wanted to buy a house, and he couldn't. He was turned down over and over again, and so he went to Connecticut, and he ended up buying a house in Connecticut. But the racism was flagrant from the 20s all the way through the 50s on Long Island.
Well, there's so much history in a book like this. We could go on and on with the stories of this. And before the time is beginning to run short, one of the things I always like to talk about is how somebody gets a book like this from all these ideas and all that research into print. And let's talk a little bit about how you navigated those waters, because it was different than your other books.
Yeah, in the past, excuse me, I was able to get a contract with and I mentioned the last time I was here, called subsidy publishing, where you put up about 15% and the publisher puts up 85%. Now, the best way, frankly, to get it published is to get an agent, but that takes a lot of time, and also there's no guarantee anything's going to work that way, and so forth. And I didn't want to do that with the other ones. So I was able to do that. But in this one, Kindle Publishing Direct, which is a division of Amazon, has made it very easy for you. They don't charge at all.
Okay.
They will publish your book for free. What you have to do, though, is have it print ready. In other words, you have to make sure that it's edited properly. You have to get somebody to do the internal formatting of it, you know, and you have to pay somebody to do that.
So where do you find that source?
Well, you'll have to research that yourself. Yeah. I found the person that I use for the mystery books. I used her again.
Oh, okay.
I'm very pleased with what she's done. But again, you have to have it print ready. Everything. They don't take responsibility for mistakes or anything like that that's done. But they'll do it for free.
And they don't put pictures in them too often.
They can do that, but that's going to cost you some money to do that.
Okay. And then once it gets done, do they help you at all with the publicizing it at all, or?
They will, obviously you can buy it on Amazon, and they will print all reviews, and they will print all ratings and those kinds of things. But that's one of the problems that I have had since I've been doing this, and that is that I'm not very good at self-promotion.
Okay.
So there's no way to really publicize it for me anyway, other than word of mouth. And but to be honest, that's not why I write. Sure, if a book took off and gained some national attention, that would be wonderful. But I'm okay with doing it for family and friends and having people, enjoy something.
It would seem like this story, though, has a lot of appeal to it, especially in this day and age. It just seems.
Trying to be objective, I'd say yes. I think it has, frankly, I think it has more appeal than the mysteries. Some people don't necessarily like the mystery genre, but this one, it's hard to imagine that you wouldn't begin to read this and enjoy it, because again, it's a story and it's real, and it has things that you can relate to. But again, there's.
I mean, you give a lot of emphasis to strong women. You give a lot of emphasis to people who've overcome prejudices of all types, people from different countries who are fighting to make their way in America. In many ways, you could have called this an American story, I think.
Yeah,
I just felt that
agree.
when I read it.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't, other than my grandmother, my great-grandmother, I didn't necessarily think about including so many strong women in it. But the truth is that Lillian Wald made it come alive for me, and especially she was involved in the suffrage movement to a large degree. And so then I started taking a look, and I found a woman that survived the Titanic, who then said, God spared me for some reason, so she was instrumental in the suffrage movement too. So there are a lot of strong women in it, but it's because that's what I found. That's what I found as I was doing it.
Well, speaking of strong women, your next project is one that I personally have some interest in.
Right. Well, there was this senior softball player, a friend of mine, Dave Hornfischer, who after I finished this book, and he read it and enjoyed it, and he told me that, and he said, you know, I have my wife's aunt was kind of a special person, and I have a lot of material about her life, you know, primary sources and so forth. Would you be interested in writing this book about her, possibly? And I said, Dave, I said, I just finished this one. It's 600 and something pages. I don't know if I have it, but I'll take a look. So let me see. And when I took a look, I was compelled. Mm-hmm. So it is a fascinating story, and I can. It's going to take place from the 20s all the way up to the 90s, and she's a fascinating woman, and I'm about a third of the way through writing it at this point, and I'm excited about it.
Well, you seem to enjoy writing. That's the sense that I've got from talking to you and reading your books. Your energy and your enthusiasm comes through in your writing.
Well, I think, and that's one of the reasons that I think I mentioned last time. I don't write every day.
Right.
You know, you have to feel it a little bit, and so you can't stay away from it too long because you lose the thread of what's going on. But once I get into it, and especially if I'm feeling that it's going the way I want to, it is kind of exciting. Although the most satisfaction comes when you're finished and you get good feedback from people.
Well, right. Well, you should from this one. This is a terrific book, and anybody out there who wants to spend a summer reading a book, it's not a short book. You have to commit to it, but it reads quick. And when I saw it took me a year to get through 900 pages on Ted Williams. I got through 600 pages here in about a month. So. And I love Ted Williams. Okay. But so anybody wants to buy it, they can get it on Amazon, I assume.
Yep.
And bookstores, do some of the local bookstores carry it?
No, no. They have trouble all the bestsellers, having all the bestsellers in them.
That's the problem with the book business these days.
Yeah.
And there are other Barnes & Noble online. You might be able to find it there.
Maybe, yeah.
Possibly, yeah.
Maybe.
But anyway, thank you all for tuning in. As I said, as I always say, the half hour with these interesting authors goes by way too fast. And Tom, once again, you're a great guest, and I enjoyed having you back again.
Thank you.
And maybe we'll get you back again when you finish this other special project that we're working on. We won't say any more about that.
No, okay.
But anyway, folks, come back and watch us. We're on Public Access TV here in Framingham, Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 8:30 at night and Saturday morning, and we put all these shows up on YouTube as well as on the Public Access's online channel. And I'd be remiss in this show tonight does have one special sad moment for me, and that's that Amy Harding, who has been the production genius behind making me and my guests look so good over all these episodes, is actually moving on to new challenges out in the state of Washington, and she's going to be missed. And you know, when you watch a show like this, you think, well, what does it take to pull it together? Well, there are the behind-the-scenes people here at Access Framingham TV, from the director to its staff, and especially the production people like Amy and her predecessor, Shavarsh Morrissey, who really helped me get started in this. So a big thank you to them, as well as a thank you to Tom and my great guests. So come back and watch us. We will be coming back again, maybe in a slightly different format. I don't know. We'll see. Good night.